Thanks, Jake and Chris, for inviting me to come. The wedding wasn't my wedding. It was my wife's best friend, and you know how these situations kind of go, I think. So it's great to be here. Obviously, my first time. And I do talk around application security all the time. And so I thought I'd change it up a little bit and talk about the future of government information sharing, because I think we're going in the wrong direction here with information sharing. And if it was bad in the past, it's getting worse. And so this Time magazine cover is actually, who can guess what year this is from? There's actually a clue on there. Yeah, it's 1995, but yeah, it's because Jerry Garcia died that year. And so, it says the U.S. rushes to turn computers into tomorrow's weapons of destruction, but how vulnerable is the home front? So it's kind of interesting that this has been going on now for almost 20 years, thinking the same problem, thinking about cyber war. I don't know if this is when it was first coined or not, but it seems like this is taking over the dialogue, right, of how we're discussing information risk and sharing information. And if we talk about things in a war context, we're going to end up with information sharing that looks like the information sharing that the military and the intelligence community benefits most from. And there won't be any information sharing that harms those interests, right? That's not how we do everything in the world. Everything isn't focused on the military being the sole beneficiary. And so right now, it seems like as Congress debates what to do with how the government's going to be involved, it seems like the military seems to have the ear of everybody, and maybe the vendors have part of the other ear. And that's kind of like the dialogue is like. So, to give an example, I think last month, the DH came out with their enhanced cybersecurity services. They call it information sharing. The law says you have to do information sharing. I call this collecting and hiding information, right? And so the enhanced cybersecurity services are basically secret black boxes that if you ask the government, they will install on your network if you're critical infrastructure. There might be some organizations that are forced to have these black boxes, and they have secret signatures on them. And so they collect information, and they're IDSs that are filled with secret signatures that have been collected from other sources. We can't get to see those signatures because that might show us that there are 0 days out there that are being exploited by adversaries, and that might expose a vulnerability that the US government wants to use in offense. So you can see the information sharing here is the least amount possible, or I guess the most amount possible, but still keeping the US government's ability to wage offensive warfare, right? Offensive cyber attacks. Now think about what if we did this in the medical context, right? There's definitely research around bioweapons, but there's also a huge amount of research around health. Would you want diseases not being researched or disclosed because they had the potential to be a bioweapon? Maybe that's actually going on, I don't know. But that seems like not benefiting the most people, right? And that's what seems to be happening here when we're kept in the dark about vulnerabilities because those vulnerabilities, the government wants to use those for offense. So that's sort of what, this is the latest idea about information sharing, is this enhanced cybersecurity services, which seems to me to be going in the wrong direction. The other vision is CISPA, and this one has been talked about in Congress for over a year now, and finally the latest version failed. But the idea here is this would feed into the enhanced cybersecurity services, right? The government would collect threat information, attack signatures, attack sources to help them program their intrusion detection systems. And it's essentially collected by the government, collected by industry, and shared in secret. So again, it's collect and hide information, even though they like to say it's collect and share information. This failed because there's all kinds of privacy problems with this. And there's probably privacy problems with the enhanced cybersecurity services out there now. But we just don't know about it because it's a classified piece of equipment. We don't really know what's going on. The other interesting thing about enhanced cybersecurity services and CISPA is there's no notion of root cause. There's no notion of actually figuring out what caused this problem to happen. It's just threat information. It's just what does the attack look like? Where is it coming from? What is the signature of it? There's no idea of actually getting to the root cause. So to sort of use the medical analogy, it's more of treating the symptoms, right? We're not actually getting at what are the cures to fix these problems. So I started thinking about, what if we start to think about, information risk out of a warfare context and in a health and safety context? Because there's actually a lot of things that the government does well to help keep everyone healthy and keep everyone safe. There's a lot of organizations that do this. And so I went looking for some of the organizations that do this constantly. So the Center for Disease Control collects information about communicable diseases, right? So we can detect epidemics. So we can figure out things like what type of flu vaccine we should create each year. And if there are new diseases that are cropping up that have entered into the country, and we have to start to think about them. OSHA is Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I'm not sure what it stands for, but the idea is whenever there's an industrial accident, we want to learn from that, right? There's some procedure, there's some process, there's some piece of equipment that's not safe, and when incidents happen, we should learn from that incident and see other people who are using that process, other people who are using that equipment. Maybe it needs to change, right? The fundamental thing there is you're able to do root cause analysis because you have this reporting. Then there's the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which takes reports of products that are unsafe, a lot of children's products. And finally, there's the National Transportation Safety Board, which investigates transportation incidents. And so I went and looked at, how does the reporting function work? How is the information collected? And it turns out for all four of these agencies, it's mandatory, right? If you fall under the law that started these different organizations, in your organization, it's actually a legal requirement for you to follow through. So for the CDC, it's mandatory reporting of infection diseases by clinicians. So whenever a clinician diagnoses an infectious disease in a person, they have to fill out a form that goes to the CDC every single time. So we know about every single infectious disease that's diagnosed by a doctor all across the country. Now, having that rich set of data allows us to learn a lot about what's going on with infectious diseases. OSHA has a requirement, a record-keeping requirement, where you have to use their system, and every time there's a serious incident, workplace incident, and I'm not sure how that's defined, but it's probably someone had to go to the hospital, that needs to be recorded, and there's all kinds of data that has to be recorded along with that. So companies just can't hide that information. They can't hide the fact that maybe their procedure was not the right procedure that was being used by an employee and they got hurt, or they're using equipment which has been deemed to be unsafe. They can't hide that fact. But if you think about what we do with data breaches, companies are able to hide what went wrong all the time. Did an employee just not configure something properly? Did they not patch something? Did they write code and not test it? That is constantly being hidden from us, that organizations are doing this, because there's no requirement to report that. If you look at the Consumer Protection, Consumer Protection and Product Safety Act, it says within 24 hours, manufacturers, importers, distributors, and retailers are required to report when there's something that could be a substantial risk of injury. They're required to do that. There's penalties and fines if you sell a product that you know is dangerous, or you become aware, you're the manufacturer, you become aware of that. Maybe one of your customers told you about it. You're required to report that. Do software vendors do this when they know about defects that are out there in the wild? No, they can handle it whatever way they want. They decide what's in their economic interests, what's in their marketing interests, right? Their product it has a defect, it's putting users of the product at risk. They've disclaimed all liability in the EULA, so they can basically do whatever they want, right? They don't have to fix it, or they can silently fix it a year from now. They can just basically do whatever they want. There's no requirement that for them to actually fix any defects or notify people of defects. So we're treating software completely differently than devices in the physical world. And then the last one is the National Transportation and Safety Bureau. And basically, if there's any type of aviation incident, they have to be notified. It's the law. You have to do that. You'll lose your pilot's license if you don't do that. You'll be fined. And so I decided to focus on the NTSB and see how they do things, because I think they're probably the closest to, besides maybe the consumer products and safety, of what information sharing really should look like that can help everyone. So commercial airlines started in the 1920s. First started just basically airmail was the first use. You got mail across the country in a day. That was a big benefit. But as the 1920s evolved and planes got bigger and safer, passenger service started. And then in the 30s, they actually had international flights. And airlines became profitable. But one thing happened with all this new air traffic. There was hundreds of accidents a year were happening with planes. As you can imagine, when there's any kind of new technology out there, it starts to be used, and accidents happen, and then eventually we say, hey, maybe we should start to make this a little bit safer. Sounds like computers to me. So the NTSB was formed in 1938. There was a law passed. It was the Civil Aeronautics Board. And so as accidents started to happen in the 30s, the government said, hey, we have to do something about this. No one's going to want to fly in a plane. There's all these benefits of it. People are dying. We need to do something about this. We need to regulate this industry. And so in 1938, they passed the law to form the NTSB's predecessor. They just changed the name afterwards, the Civil Aeronautics Board. And their first major investigation was in 1940. It was a Douglas DC-3A crashed somewhere around DC. I think there was like 20 or 30 people on board, and including a U.S. senator, and a lot of people died in the plane. And that was the very first incident that was reported. So 20 years or so after commercial travel became a reality, the government said, hey, we're going to step in and we're going to start to investigate why these planes are crashing, and we're going to figure out how to make it better. What went wrong? What were the procedures? Or was there mechanical problems that could be fixed? Unless we can figure out why the plane crashed, we're not going to make improvements, and we're not going to leave it just to the vendor to investigate this. Like Douglas, I'm sure Douglas Aircraft was pretty interested in looking at this plane and seeing what happened to see if it was a technical failure. But what if it was just a procedural failure, or the pilot didn't have the right training? Or maybe Douglas wanted to keep this a secret because they didn't want to scare people from flying their other planes, which were all at risk. You know, it sounds like that would be bad for air travel, right? But that's exactly what we have now with computer security. So here's a chart of air accidents from 1918 to 2009. I wish it was normalized to the number of actual flights, because we know that the flights are increasing hugely, especially between 1980 and 2000. But the interesting thing is you have this quick ramp up of incidents. From 1920 to 1940 or 41 or so, we're going from around 100 to 500 in a 20-year period. That's per year. So you can see, like right around 1940, people are saying, wow, we need to do something about this. That slope just can't keep going up. And that's when the NTSB was formed. And so I don't know if that's the only reason that the accidents started to come down, but it had to be a factor. It's just too much of a coincidence that accidents started to dramatically come down right after there was an agency of the US government was given authority, and there was mandatory reporting of every incident, and every serious incident was investigated for root causes. And those root causes were distributed to the people who were best able to fix them. So I don't think it's a coincidence. And I wonder if, our breaches that keep going up and up and up, one way to stop that is to start to make changes and do things like the NTSB. So here's an example of the aviation disclosure form. It's on the web now. Every incident that happens, no matter how minor, people don't have to, even be injured. If a plane goes down in a way that it wasn't supposed to land, the pilot's required to fill out this form. And this is actually the query mechanism. So you can go and you can search for any airline incident that's ever happened and find out all the details about it. And you can mine that data and study that data. We have nothing like that for computer incidents. And here's an example of a form I pulled up. It was near where I live in Stowe, Massachusetts, where a pilot with 2 passengers flying a little Cessna crashed his plane on landing. No one was hurt. But you can see, I don't know, you probably can't see, but there's a lot of detail. This is only the first page. There's like 4 pages of detail that needs to be filled out for every incident. And then there's actually a narrative history of the flight. You probably can't read that. I don't know if I can read it. But it says, it talks about basically the landing on final approach began to pick up gusts. Below the tree line, wind shear picked up. On short final, roughly 75 feet altitude, lost lift due to wind shear, added power to compensate and go around. I touched on the threshold and was going around when a gust pushed me to the left when I realized I wasn't going to make it over the trees. I reduced power and tried to turn right to stay over the runway. I hit the trees on the left of the runway and came to a stop. I confirmed nobody was hurt and had them egress through the left side door while I secured the plane. So it seems pretty mundane. But the interesting thing is the pilot has to put in a recommendation here. From what the pilot learned during the incident, it asks, what is your safety recommendation? How could this accident or incident have been prevented? And the pilot puts in, a weather reporting station would have told me how much wind was gusting on the airport. A windsock within sight of runway 30 would have helped detect gusts and crosswinds. So for this really mundane incident, gladly no one was hurt, we got a recommendation which seems like a clear improvement for this airport. There's no windsock. There's no weather reporting station telling him or her what the wind is. What if we did this for every computer incident that happened? If people were required to report what they knew about the incident and were required to put in recommendations to say how they think it should be fixed. And then we could go and query that information. We could go and query all of that and learn, and people could study it and figure out how to improve. Without visibility into the details of the incidents, really we just have anecdotal detail. We have detail from the incidents we've been involved in, or if we're lucky to have someone talk about an incident. There's all kinds of reasons people don't want to talk about incidents that hide a huge amount of information from us. So the idea behind these reports is to learn from the incidents and improve, do the root cause analysis, get recommendations, and also do public investigations for serious incidents. So this is a minor incident. There's no need to do an investigation. But if someone had died or it was a larger aircraft, there would be a public investigation. So you wouldn't just go by what the owner-operator pilot of the plane had to say. You know, I'm sure they're being truthful because they could be investigated at any time and lose their pilot's license if they weren't. But the public investigation puts people that are experts that have tools and capabilities and knowledge to investigate an incident that an individual who's just a pilot, or if we use the corollary in the IT space, a lot of companies don't have sophisticated investigators to do their forensics, and they don't always call in an expert. So we don't even know if we could have learned from incidents. We might not even be learning from them because the reporting is so bad and there's no public investigation to go on top of it. But the key to this is this follows sound engineering principle of learning from failures. Engineers love to learn from failures. If any part of that plane was defective and a piece of that plane failed, I can tell you the engineers that built that plane want to know everything they can about that, and they want to fix it. Same thing with a bridge collapsing, right? The engineers want to know how to fix that. It just seems with computers, it's almost like the engineers want you to go away when there's a failure, right? They don't want to hear about the incidents. They barely want to hear about the vulnerability reports when there's clearly a defect in their product. And it's interesting that engineering discipline, I was trained as an engineer in computer and systems engineering at Rensselaer, and a lot of the training was to use the engineering mindset, and which I think is different than the computer science mindset. So engineers want to learn from their failures, and I don't think we have enough engineering discipline in the way we build software and build computer systems, because that just doesn't seem to be something that people care about. So the outcome of all this collecting of the data and the public investigations really is two different things. So they have safety recommendations and safety alerts. So safety recommendations are directed at the organization best able to address the safety issue, whether it's public or private. So if that airport there, which needs a windsock, maybe it needs a weather reporting station that the pilot has access to, that would be a recommendation to the airport. It's, you need to put in a windsock, right? If it was a metal fatigue in a particular kind of airplane wing, it would be the manufacturer would say, hey, these wings after 20 years are getting fatigued and failing, right? That's what we determined from our investigation. So we're notifying you. So you tell people to take this plane out of service before this, or you figure out a way to not have this fail or have a way to repair it. So it's the person best suited to address the issue. And then they have safety alerts, which are more general alerts. This one here, this was the most recent safety alert that came out like a month ago, which is basically to anyone operating a plane, activate leading edge de-ice boots as soon as airplane enters icing conditions. Thin amount of ice as little as quarter inch can be deadly. So that's the outcome of lots of different investigations. This is their new recommendation about how to operate a plane in icing conditions. And every pilot sees this, and every pilot follows this. It's very different when you think about computer security notifications. It doesn't seem like people are following the notifications for all the technology they use or even aware, and it's because they're so fragmented. There's not one place that you go and you get information about ways to run your systems more securely. So now over to the cyber realm. And you know, I put this up here because sometimes it's depressing when I see some of the rhetoric that happens in these cybersecurity hearings. And I'm sure there are smart people that are staffers for these legislators, but it always seems like there's a lot of ignorance out there, and people are just not thinking through cybersecurity the way we think through, you know, how do we tackle other safety problems or health problems. That lens just isn't put on cybersecurity, and it's always it seems like it's a warfare lens or an espionage lens always gets put on it. So, but there is a quasi-government agency, actually, and now it is I guess it's a fully funded government agency that does have a history with internet incidents. So in 1988, after the Morris worm ran around the internet, DARPA funded the CERT Coordination Center at Carnegie Mellon, and they were funded to coordinate a response to incidents. So the idea was, well, what are we going to do when these worms happen? Someone's got to figure out what's going on, and we have to come up with a way to stop it and a way to fix it, and maybe make some recommendations so that people, you know, can run their systems so it's less likely that this happens again. So if you look at what the outcome of the Morris worm, it's available online. There's like a 40-page document of the investigation. It reads like one of these NTSB reports. I read the report from the DC-3 plane that crashed in 1940, and it was about the same length as the Morris worm, which went through, it had source code, it had all the different debugging things about how the worm operated, recommendations on how to harden systems, recommendations on how to you know, coordinate responses to other worms in the future. And it kind of reminded me of the early days of the NTSB. And then we had, but the internet was still very small back then, right? The internet was it wasn't commercial yet. And in 1992, Congress passed a law that allowed commercial traffic to go over NSFnet, which was the backbone of the internet. And this is where Al Gore gets his famous "I invented the internet," because he was the one that promoted this law. So he seriously misspoke there, but he does deserve credit for opening up the the academic government internet to commercial. And here we are 21 years later, and obviously it's been a huge success. But also 20 years later, what happened to our internet investigation capability? Right? It was there in the very, very beginning. It was like when the first plane went up, they said, hey, you know, or when the very first plane crashed, they said, hey, we're going to have to do something about these plane crashes. We're going to have to investigate. That didn't happen. It was 20 years of plane crashes. It was, if you looked at my chart, it had to get to 500 plane crashes a year before anything happened. But then something did happen. It seemed to make a positive effect. So here in the internet incident, we had it right away at the very first serious incident, the Morris worm. But then the CERT CC ended up not really being funded as the internet grew and as incidents picked up. So that capability went away, really. And what CERT changed into is just coordinating vulnerability disclosure. And that's kind of how it was throughout the 90s. If there was a vulnerability, especially in shared code, that was shared across a lot of different products, like operating system code or libraries, they did a really good job at coordinating all the vendors to fix those things and release that. But there was no real incident capability. That went by the wayside. Now there is an incident capability starting to pick up. So I should just take a step back. So DHS decided to fund CERT about 5 years ago, and they changed the name to uscert.gov. And there's a section of that now called ICS CERT. Industrial Control System cert. And that team actually does do investigations. So they track the vulnerabilities that are in industrial control systems. And if there are incidents at critical infrastructure facilities, they actually do formal investigations of those incidents. But the problem is it's secret, right? We don't get to learn. So there was three in 2009 when they started doing it. There was 3 incidents that they investigated, and now I think in 2012 they investigated 177 incidents. But we don't get to know what happened, what was the root cause, anything about those incidents. All we know is a number. There are industrial control system incidents, which, I mean, we probably knew that already, but at least we know kind of the scope of it. But it's in secret again. Everything's in secret. So we do have some laws that compel incident disclosure, and they're all focused around data breaches and PII. So these laws were not created to learn from these incidents and improve. They were just created to protect the consumers that were at risk. So let them know they're at risk now of identity theft. So these data breach laws came, I think California had the first one around 2003, or maybe a little bit earlier. And pretty much most of the states have them now. They're all state laws. There is no national unifying law. They've tried to do it, but it hasn't passed. And it's really only for incidents where PII is stolen, where you could be at risk for identity theft. Now, California did something that was actually quite interesting. I think just a few weeks ago, they passed they changed the disclosure requirements that if it's just email addresses and hashed password information, that needs to be disclosed also. So organizations where that information is compromised have to report that now. I guess if anyone in California is affected, which probably means everyone has to report that now. The law is so new, I don't think a lot of people have thought this through, because there's a lot of sites out there, little tiny sites that maybe it's your WordPress site that has username and password information. If your WordPress site gets breached and you have a California resident as one of your users, the law says you have to make a notification of your breach. Now, we see these things where a vulnerability comes out in WordPress, and we see thousands of WordPress sites breached in a matter of days. Are we going to get thousands of disclosures from all those WordPress sites? I don't know. So it'd be interesting to see that. But the idea is California says, hey, that person is at risk now because of some failure by the site owner. They should have to tell the people who are at enhanced risk that this happened. So I think that's interesting. So it wouldn't be fair to not have a datalossdb.org slide in here. And this is the incidents that are public. So it gets public one way or another. It could be because of a disclosure requirement, because PII was breached. And I think that's probably why most of these incidents become public. But you can see that it seems to be pretty much increasing. The trend is increasing each year. In 2013, we probably only have 3 months of data there, and it looks like it could potentially get up to 2012. So data breaches are certainly on the increase. And then here's the different state laws. Like each state has different requirements. I was talking with a company that's writing software to automate incident response, and the part of their functionality that's the most interesting to customers is they put in the type of breach, and it tells them which state's attorney generals they have to notify, because there's really no way for any one person to understand all the different legal requirements. This is making it look simple because there's just really five things here, but it tells you when you have to notify, Are there civil or criminal penalties for not promptly notifying? I'm not sure what private right of action is. Exemption for encrypted personal info. So there's one state which doesn't exempt, District of Columbia doesn't exempt if the personal info was encrypted, you still have to make a notification. Is there an exemption for criminal investigations? So if there's a criminal investigation going on, you don't have to report it. And then some of these states have exemptions for immaterial breaches, which I'm not 100% sure what that means, but you can see that it's very fragmented. So even though we think it's a good idea to even disclose PII breaches, they aren't always disclosed in every state. So the breach disclosure is really to notify the people who was compromised. No requirement to disclose the root cause, so that can remain secret. So imagine if the NTSB, the agency, the law said that when a plane crashed, it had to be reported that the plane crashed. So plane tail number this, crashed at this date, and that was it, right? That's essentially what we have. It's just a notification that there was a data breach, and that's really the end of the story. That's it. If someone asks, how did the plane crash? I have a plane just like that, or I follow the same procedures as that pilot. We fly in the same weather. How did it crash? I want to know, because that could help me. And there was no information there. They just said, yeah, no, they don't have to disclose any of that. We just have to disclose that the incident happened. We don't have to disclose anything that you might take away and learn from. So that's really what we have right now with all these data breach disclosure laws and all the information sharing that the government talks so much about and is so hopeful that it's going to help us. So I looked at two recent incidents that happened, Drupal just a few days ago. And this is basically what Drupal says, is Ross declined to name the third party responsible for the flaw, saying only that the company has worked with the software vendor to confirm the known vulnerability, which has been publicly disclosed. We will wait. We are still investigating and will share more detail when it's appropriate, which usually means never. I see these statements all the time, and I'm going to follow up. Maybe they will. A month from now, I'm like, is it appropriate yet? A year from now, is it appropriate yet? And there's plenty of breaches that this is the kind of statement that comes out, and it's never disclosed. They say, yeah, we're going to do it after the investigation. So, if you're running that third-party piece of software, maybe you have a website just like Drupal.org. Maybe you're running that piece of software too. It'd be kind of nice to know what it was and that there is a fix available. And then the Federal Reserve, earlier this year, this is what their statement was. The Federal Reserve System is aware that information was obtained by exploiting a temporary vulnerability in a website vendor product. I mean, they're basically saying there was a vulnerability somewhere on their system in a vendor product. But that's all they're telling us. And then they're very happy to say the exposure was fixed shortly after discovery and is no longer an issue. I did some digging around, and people seem to think it's a cold fusion vulnerability that there was a known patch available for. And cold fusion sites are notoriously bad for staying up to date with the latest patch level. So, if the Federal Reserve was to come out, a major breach like this and say, it was cold fusion was the problem. There's so many vulnerabilities in it, it's hard for us to maintain the proper patch level. We're going to have to expend more resources and get better at it. That would be almost like the NTSB saying, here is a recommendation for people who have cold fusion systems, right? But we don't get that. We get people covering their ass, right? Because they think they did something wrong and it has to be a secret, right? Once the vulnerability it's a known vulnerability, and once it's patched, why not tell everyone about it? But there's this culture of secrecy so that no one's able to learn from failures, even when the breach comes out. How many breaches like Drupal and Federal Reserve breaches are happening right now that will never see the light of day because the organization, because it never became public? I mean, the Federal Reserve became public because it was a hacktivist that posted the information up on Pastebin. Or actually, it was on some Chinese Pastebin, I think it was, which is a lot harder for the Federal Reserve to take down. And the Drupal we know about because they reset everyone's password. But of course, there's other incidents that happen all the time that don't become public. So even when they're public, we're not getting information. Imagine the ones that aren't even have to be disclosed. So I went and looked at the 6 biggest breaches of early 2012. Dark Reading had a nice compendium of the 6 biggest breaches because I wanted to see, are we learning from these, even the major incidents? This is like when the jumbo jet crashes. The engine falls off the plane, it crashes. These are the biggest incidents out there. Zappos, 24 million records, 4 digits of credit card numbers, email, phone numbers, encrypted passwords. Root cause, unknown. Lessons learned, none. Right? So we have no idea. We can't learn anything from Zappos. University of North Carolina, 350,000 records, including Social Security numbers. Oh, so the first one of Zappos, they reset everyone's password, so they had to kind of notify everybody. University of North Carolina is actually, this was healthcare information. So they were legally required to disclose this to the people who were victims. And they said, hey, this system was supposed to be a back-end system, and it was exposed to the internet. Well, I don't know about you, but even my back-end systems have authentication, right, and access control. So this seemed like it was a complete screw-up, right? So the information was completely wide open on the server, and then that server was accessible from the internet. But there's a lesson learned there. You need change control. They said, yeah, someone changed some rules and they exposed it. So you need better change control. You need better access control. So from this incident, we do have some lessons learned. Global payment systems, 7 million consumer records, including 1.5 million credit cards. So probably one of the worst breaches of the year. Unknown how that happened. We have no idea. You can't learn anything. You think there's other people processing credit cards that might be running the same software? I think so. But global payment systems isn't helping anyone. They're covering their butt. South Carolina Health and Human Services. Patient records, 228,000 patient records. Employee was emailing them a few at a time over a period of a year out to some email account. An insider basically stealing the data. And obviously, someone who's dealing with really sensitive information, financial records, health records, would want to have some sort of a DLP solution so employees with access couldn't just throw it on a hard drive or email it. And of course, that was disclosed because it was health information. Then University of Nebraska, 654,000 student records, including SSN, again, unknown. And then LinkedIn, one of the other big breaches of the year, 6.5 million usernames and passwords, again, unknown. So, 4 out of the 6 here, there was a potential to learn from these incidents, but we didn't. But there are some good things out there. And it's interesting that it's not coming from the government. It's coming from commercial organizations that do incident response. So TrustWave and Verizon's DBIR are probably the 2 biggest, best, most famous. And these are this is basically all we have. So I commend these organizations as service providers because they have access to a lot of customer data to anonymize it and make it public so we can learn. The problem is it's very heavily biased by the customer base. If you look at both of these reports, a huge amount of these incidents are all retail and they're all PCI related. So we know a lot about a certain kind of IT system. And we know a lot about that particular way those are configured, what the software is around small retailers and credit card breaches, which is good. At least we know about that. But for me, that's a very small window of the organizations that could potentially be breached. If you look at the top 6, there was only one that was related to credit cards. So that bias is clearly there. The other problem is, it's only summary data. So we only know things like, it was known vulnerabilities attacked, or it was, passwords that were guessed. It's only summary. We never get like the product name, right? We never get the organization or any details around it. So, looking at the NTSB, imagine if their reports were, oh yeah, this year 11 planes crashed due to metal fatigue. Because it was only summary data. That's what they reported on. And that's all that came out of that report. As someone who flies a lot, I'd kind of want to know which type of planes had that metal fatigue so I could say, hey, are these manufacturers dealing with this problem? Are they taking them out of service? Are they getting them fixed before putting them back in? There's no way to follow up on that. There's no way to know with just the summary information. And one of the big problems I see is the root cause data is weak, which is the most important thing to learn from. It's very general. It's not specific at all. Here's two examples of two of the better ones out there. This one is from the Web Hacking Incident database, where whenever there's a public website breach, they record what happened. And the biggest category, 37%, is unreported. So with public information, as we know, oftentimes you don't know what the cause was. And they have 27% SQL injection, 23% denial of service, and a lot down in the 1% range. This is actually from Data Loss DB, and you can't read it, but the biggest category at 32% is hack. It was a hack. That doesn't really help us. I can't fix that easily. And then this one you can't read at 9%, just as it was something it was a web. Web was the problem. And then there's all these little details here of the laptop was stolen, the tape was stolen, which are pretty specific. But the stuff that's around, a technical vulnerability is very vague, and it's not, Data Loss DB's fault. They're using the information that's publicly available. It's that no one is recording this information, or no one's required to report the details. So it's very hard to learn to be actionable with that data. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of hacking going on. Do better hack prevention stuff. That's what you take away from that. So then I put these charts next to each other, and this is actually a 10-year span, and that's a 20-year span. But you see that data breaches are accelerating, or at least growing, kind of the way that air accidents were happening. And you have to wonder, is that chart just going to keep going up and up and up? Are the things that we're doing to manage incidents going to change the slope of that chart? So my thought after learning about how the NTSB worked, I changed transportation to cyber. Because cyber, you have to have it. It's got to be named cyber if it's the government. If we put InfoSec in there, or computer risk, or assurance, people would just be leaving the room. But if we put cyber in there, hey, a cyber safety board? Yeah, that sounds like that's got some legs. So the idea is to take the model of the NTSB and make it mandatory that you have to report these incidents. And there's a form with all the details that you have to fill in, which means you actually have to gather that information. And you can put a narrative in there about how, what happened. And it should have a recommendation in there. The person who responded to the incident might, if they're an expert enough, is probably in a great place to make a recommendation. So then all of a sudden we're going to have recommendations about how to stop different root causes. And the goal would to make actionable knowledge, right? Things that we can actually act on. Now I know businesses are going to want anonymity, right? There is anonymity with communicable diseases, not for the doctor, but for the patient. So the doctor has to put his or her name there, but the patient is anonymous. But when a plane goes down, that's not anonymous. We know who the pilot is. We know who the owner of the plane is. We know who the manufacturer is. We know where it happened, what time it happened. We know all those details. That's not anonymous. Consumer product safety, we certainly know what the product is and what the failure is. So it seems in the computer realm, everyone's going to want to be an anonymous reporter. And if businesses were able to keep that anonymity, and that was something that I had to trade off in return of getting the details, I would do that. But just like with the consumer safety, I think that the vendors certainly of the products that were that failed, if there were any, should certainly be part of that report, or we can't really learn from it. So here's some of the things we can learn. So I'm in application security, so something near and dear to my heart is learning what classes of application vulnerabilities are being attacked. Because that way we can prioritize what we fix, right? A lot of organizations just fix SQL injection, right? Because they hear in the news, SQL injections used here, SQL injections used there. That might be true. We don't really have any consistent empirical evidence because it's all anecdotal. It's all whoever happened to be reported on or was required to report. What's the next thing you fix after SQL injection? I don't know. There's probably a second most prevalent thing that's attacked, but we really don't know what that is, so we can't prioritize effectively. We could learn the exploit rate of known vulnerabilities, right? People try to gather this by, looking over the internet and looking for certain signatures of attacks. We would actually know not just attacks, which everyone seems to report attacks all the time because attacks are easy to. It's easy to understand attacks. And you see this all the time. It came out, the power company said, we're attacked 3,000 times a day. Well, that's meaningless because if the attack isn't successful, it's totally meaningless, right? So we actually need to know when the vulnerabilities are actually exploited. That's what we can use to understand how to improve and how to prioritize. Maybe a lot of vulnerabilities are really trivially blocked, but we don't know that. We see really high attack rates. Well, another thing we don't really understand is non-regulated data and non-regulated entities when they get compromised. The only visibility we have is when there's a law compelling people to disclose, and that's almost always regulated data. So there's all these compromises of hacktivist type compromises, espionage type compromises where they're stealing intellectual property. There's no requirement to report those. So we don't know if those attack methodologies are different in any way. We don't have any visibility into that. So I couldn't help but put a couple slides in from Veracode's State of Software Security report, just to show how the data might be used if we had actual data about what are the root causes out there. So this is from about 20,000 applications that Veracode tested over the last 18 months. These, for 4 different languages, Cold Fusion, PHP, .NET, and Java, this is the prevalence of these flaws. So how many applications are affected by one or more SQL injection? So you can see for Cold Fusion, about 72% or so of Cold Fusion applications have SQL injection. It's a lot better for PHP, .NET, and Java, where we see it's around 30, 32, 33%. So we know that these are the vulnerabilities that are latent in the average application out there. Cross-site scripting, a lot higher for everybody. Cold Fusion, again, stands out. Crypto issues, you can see that .NET and Java there's more crypto errors in those applications than Cold Fusion and PHP. I think that's because it's more abstracted away from the developer. There's less ways for them to shoot themselves in the foot. And then directory traversal and command injection. So this is what, if you haven't tested your application, or you test your application for the first time, this is what you're likely to find, the likelihood that you're going to find one of these. And then we went and we looked and said, what are developers actually fixing? What are developers, after their first test, what are they fixing? And then they send it to us for a retest. And it's amazing how variable it is. And it's actually amazing how little is actually fixed. If you look at, no, my chart isn't showing up there. What was the, so it was command injection, directory traversal, and were the first two. Directory traversal, it's barely getting fixed. Like people are, just ignoring that one altogether. SQL injection, which you see is, obviously a bad problem, is being fixed by Cold Fusion, but, .NET developers are only fixing 18%. So what if we were able to prioritize the classes of vulnerability that were being attacked? We had real data to show exactly what is the likelihood that a vulnerability is going to be exploited of a certain class, and we gave that information to the developers and said, 53% of applications with SQL injection will be compromised within 6 months, mean time to compromise or something like that. That might actually change their behavior. They might actually change the way they're looking at fixing problems, because it wouldn't all be anecdotal and, oh yeah, it's in the OWASP top 10, and some people are saying, it's like, no, this is exactly how many sites were compromised this year with SQL injection. Exactly. And you'd almost be negligent if you didn't fix it, if you knew that, a certain percentage were going to be attacked within 6 months and compromised, right? Now everyone can say, I don't know. I don't know if I really need to fix that. I think it's a low priority. We have other things we need to do. Because there's no hard data, no one can be negligent for anything. If there's no known root causes, I don't have to fix anything. Because it's the data, the hard data is not there, and that's the state where we're in. So I originally started to have these thoughts when the National Data Breach Reporting Law was being talked about, and I wanted to put in some input to say, I think it's good to make it consistent across the states, but we need more data reported. We need to look at the model like these other government agencies are doing, where there's mandatory reporting of root causes so we can improve. So I'm not holding my breath, but I'm going to talk to people up on Capitol Hill to try to get them to start to see things this way. So I guess now I can take questions on any of this, or if you want to talk about software security, that's fine too. Yep, good. I'm getting the STFU sign. So thank you everyone for listening to me. It was great to be here.